Lightning cracked over the hills of Millbrook, Ohio. I ran toward the only open door in sight, an old stone church, abandoned for years. Waited in the dark, pushed inside, gasping, expecting silence and dust. Instead, a candle flickered near the altar. A woman sat alone on the front pew, crying. She looked up, startled, eyes red and wide. Neither of us said a word for a long, breathless moment. My name is Mara Whitfield, and I had spent 29 years learning how to disappear inside myself, how to fold my truth into something small enough for my family to accept without ever truly seeing me. That storm, and the woman I found inside that forgotten church, would unravel every careful lie I had built, though I did not know it yet as I stood dripping on the cracked marble floor. "Sorry," she said quickly, wiping her face with her sleeve. "I didn't think anyone else would be crazy enough to be out here." "Neither did I answered, still catching my breath, water pooling around my sneakers on the old stone floor. She introduced herself as Jo Calloway, said she came here sometimes when Millbrook felt too small to hold her thoughts. I told her I was just passing through, visiting my mother for the weekend, though something about her voice made me want to stay longer. We sat 2 pews apart, listening to rain hammer the roof, neither of us in a hurry to leave the shelter. She asked why a stranger's church looked so familiar to me, and I admitted my grandmother used to bring me here as a child. "It closed the year she died," I said, and Jo's expression softened like she understood loss better than most people her age. She told me the church was set to be sold next spring, torn down for a parking lot, and something in her voice cracked when she said it. By the time the storm passed, we had moved to the same pew, talking like people who had known each other far longer than an hour. When she finally stood to leave, she pressed a folded napkin into my palm with her phone number scrawled across it in blue ink. I told myself I would not call her, that I was only in Millbrook for 2 more days before flying back to Chicago. But by the second night, I found myself dialing the number, my heart thudding harder than it had in years. Jo picked up on the second ring, laughing when she realized it was me, as if she had been hoping I'd call. We met at a diner on Route 9, and she ordered black coffee while I fumbled through the menu, too nervous to choose. She told me she taught art at the local high school, and that Millbrook had never quite felt like enough for either of us. I found myself watching her hands as she talked, the way she gestured when she got excited about a painting she was working on. When she asked about my life in Chicago, I gave her the polished version, the job, the apartment, all the things that sounded impressive and empty. She saw through it instantly, tilting her head and asking, "But what do you actually want, Mara?" No one had asked me that in years, and I didn't have an answer ready, which unsettled me more than I let on. Before I flew home, we sat in her car outside the church, watching the sun set behind the crumbling bell tower. "Come back," she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Even if it's just to see the old church again." Promised I would, though I wasn't sure yet what I was really promising to return for. Back in Chicago, I caught myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for a message from a small town I barely knew. Jo texted photos of her students' paintings, of the church at sunrise, of small ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary coming from her. Within a month, I was flying back to Millbrook every other weekend, telling my coworkers I was visiting family. My mother noticed the sudden visits and assumed I was simply homesick, never suspecting there was someone pulling me back. Jo and I began fixing up the old church together, sweeping dust, patching the roof, pretending we were only saving a building. One evening, while repainting the door frame, our hands brushed, and neither of us pulled away for a long moment. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," she admitted, staring at the paint can instead of at me. I didn't answer with words. I simply reached over and laced my fingers through hers, and she let me. We stood there in silence, paint drying on the door frame, both of us finally admitting what we had been avoiding for weeks. I need you to know something, Joe said, pulling back slightly. This town isn't kind to people like us. I'm not afraid of this town, I told her, though the words felt braver than I actually was. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, like she was carrying a weight she hadn't shared with me yet. That night, she kissed me for the first time, gentle and hesitant, as if testing whether the ground beneath us would hold. It held, and something inside me finally exhaled after years of holding my breath around everyone I loved. We didn't call it anything at first. Just two women restoring an old church and stealing quiet moments between the pews. But every week the distance between friendship and something deeper grew smaller, until there was no pretending left. Jo started leaving her sketchbook at my mother's guest room. Small drawings of me tucked between pages of the church restoration plans. I found one sketch of my own hands, and beneath it she had written, "Hands that make me believe in staying." I began imagining a future in Millbrook, something I never thought I'd want. Small-town mornings instead of Chicago's endless noise. My job offered me a transfer to their regional office 2 hours from Millbrook, and I said yes before fully thinking it through. Jo cried when I told her, "Actualtears," saying no one had ever rearranged their life for her before. "I'm not rearranging my life for you," I said gently. "I'm building one I actually want, and you're part of it." We spent that summer restoring the church's stained glass, piece by piece, sunlight scattering color across the old wooden pews. Her students helped too, unaware that their favorite teacher was falling in love in the very building they were repairing. At night, we'd sit on the church steps, sharing takeout, talking about everything from art history to our messy family stories. Jo told me about her father, a pastor 2 towns over, who hadn't spoken to her in almost 6 years. "He found letters I wrote to a girl in college," she said quietly. "He hasn't looked at me the same since." I held her hand tighter, realizing our stories, though different, shared the same aching shape of being unseen by family. My mother invited Jo to Sunday dinner, thinking she was simply my new friend from town, someone helping with a church project. I sat through the meal terrified, watching my mother praise Jo's paintings without any idea what those hands meant to me. Afterward, Jo squeezed my hand in the driveway and said, "One day, I want her to know the whole truth." "One day," I repeated, though the words tasted like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. My older brother, Daniel, visited that fall and immediately sensed something different in how I spoke about Jo. "You light up when you say her name," he said bluntly over coffee. "Is there something you're not telling us?" I panicked and denied it, watching his eyes narrow with the particular disappointment of someone who already suspects the truth. That night, I told Jo about the conversation, terrified my family would connect the dots before I was ready. "You can't keep living in 2 separate worlds forever," she said, her voice edged with a frustration she rarely showed. I promised her time. Just a little more time, though even I could hear how thin that promise sounded. The church restoration deadline arrived faster than expected. The diocese announced a final decision meeting in December. If we couldn't raise enough money and support, the building would be sold to developers by January. Jo threw herself into fundraising, organizing art shows, bake sales, anything to save the place that had brought us together. I helped quietly from the sidelines, still unwilling to be photographed too closely beside her at public events. One evening, a photo of us laughing together at a fundraiser ended up on the town's community Facebook page. Comments accumulated quickly, some kind, others cruel, questioning what kind of relationship the new teacher had with that Whitfield girl. My mother saw the post before I could explain it to her myself, and her silence afterward said more than any argument. "Is it true?" she finally asked, voice flat, refusing to meet my eyes across the kitchen table. I couldn't lie anymore. Not with Jo's photograph still glowing on the screen between us. "Yes," I said. "I love her." Mom. I have for months. And I'm done pretending otherwise. My mother left the room without another word. And the silence that followed lasted for 11 unbearable days. Jo tried to comfort me. But I could see fear creeping into her own eyes. Fear of becoming the reason my family broke apart. Maybe I should step back, she said one night. Give your mother time without me being the reminder. No, I said firmly. I won't lose you to protect people who won't even try to understand. The school. Rumors spread among students and parents, and the principal called Jo in for a concerned conversation. She came home shaking, saying they hadn't threatened her job outright, but the warning underneath their words was unmistakable. I built my whole career here, she whispered. I can't lose it over people's discomfort with who I love. I held her that night, both of us aware that our happiness had suddenly become something the whole town felt entitled to judge. 2 weeks later, my best friend from Chicago, Priya, visited and immediately noticed the tension humming beneath everything I said. Over wine. I confided everything, relieved to finally speak the truth to someone who wasn't tangled in Millbrook's opinions. What I didn't know was that Priya had mentioned it, casually, to a coworker who also knew my regional manager. Within a week, whispers reached my new office, and my manager scheduled an unexpected performance check-in that felt anything but routine. We've had some client concerns about optics, he said vaguely, refusing to name what exactly those concerns involved. I realized then that Priya's careless slip had followed me 2 hours away, threatening the very job that let me stay near Jo. Furious and hurt, I confronted Priya, who apologized but couldn't undo what had already spread through both our worlds. I didn't think it mattered who knew, she said weakly, not understanding how much it mattered to me. That betrayal cut deeper than the town's whispers ever had, because I had trusted her with the most fragile part of myself. Jo found me crying in the church that night, and instead of offering easy comfort, she simply sat beside me in silence. People will fail you, she finally said. The question is whether you'll still choose to stay soft anyway. I didn't have an answer yet, but her steady presence beside me felt like the only solid ground left standing. December arrived cold and unforgiving, the church fundraiser falling $3,000 short of the diocese's final requirement. Jo proposed one last idea, a community art exhibit inside the church itself, tickets sold to cover the remaining balance. We spent every evening after work hanging paintings, stringing lights, transforming the crumbling nave into something breathtaking again. The night of the exhibit, the church filled with more people than either of us expected, curiosity outweighing judgment for once. My mother appeared at the door near closing time, standing awkwardly near the entrance, unsure whether she was welcome. Jo noticed her first and quietly told me, "Go. This might be the only chance you get." You walked over? Heart-pounding. And my mother finally spoke. Your grandmother loved this church. I couldn't stay away. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was the first real conversation we'd had in weeks. She looked around slowly at the paintings, the lights. The community gathered to save something meaningful, and something in her posture softened. Before leaving, she paused beside Jo's largest painting, a portrait of the church bathed in golden light, and studied it for a long moment. You have real talent, she told Jo quietly, the closest thing to acceptance she could manage that night. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And Jo squeezed my hand once my mother had walked away. The exhibit raised enough to cover the shortfall, and the diocese agreed to grant the church a 1-year reprieve. We celebrated quietly afterward, exhausted but relieved, allowing ourselves a rare, unguarded moment of pure happiness. But relief was short-lived. 2 days later, Jo received an official letter from the school board regarding her contract renewal. They're citing budget cuts, she said, though we both suspected the real reason lingered somewhere behind those polite, bureaucratic words. Her hand shook as she read it a second time, searching for any sign the decision could be reversed. I've given this school 6 years, she said bitterly. I refused to let them push me out quietly. She requested a formal meeting with the board, determined to make them say the real reason to her face. I offered to come with her, but she shook her head. This is something I need to face myself. The night before the meeting, we barely slept, lying tangled together, whispering reassurances neither of us fully believed. Whatever happens, she said into the darkness, I don't regret one single day of loving you. I memorized the sound of her voice in that moment, terrified of how much was riding on the next morning. At the meeting, the board cited parental complaints, alongside vague budget language, refusing to state anything more directly. Jag stod. Voice steady despite the tremor I knew was underneath, and asked them plainly if her contract was ending because she was gay. The room fell silent, no one willing to answer the question out loud, which was answer enough for both of us. She walked out with her head high, though I could see her composure crack the moment we reached the parking lot. 6 years, she repeated, staring blankly at the school building. 6 years. And this is how it ends. I wrapped my arms around her right there in the lot, not caring who saw us or what they whispered afterward. That week, local news picked up the story after a former student's parent spoke out in Joe's defense. Suddenly Millbrook was divided loudly, some rallying support for Joe, others defending the board's vague, cowardly decision. My mother, watching the coverage at home, called me for the first time since the exhibit, her voice tight with worry. Is she all right? She asked. And I realized, that her concern was genuine, however complicated it still felt. No, I admitted. But she's fighting. And I'm not going anywhere while she does. My mother was quiet for a long moment before saying, bring her to dinner. Properly this time. It wasn't a grand declaration of acceptance, but after everything, it felt like an open door finally creaking wider. Joe hesitated when I told her, afraid of being paraded as some kind of peace offering rather than a person. She wants to know you, I said gently. Not the controversy. You. Just you. She agreed, cautiously. And I could tell it cost her something to hope again after being disappointed so publicly. Meanwhile, a lawyer contacted Joe pro bono, offering to help her challenge the school board's decision through mediation. Dinner with my mother went better than either of us expected. Tense but honest. Old wounds finally spoken aloud instead of buried. I don't fully understand it, my mother admitted over dessert. But I understand that you make my daughter happy. It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was real. And real felt like more than enough that night. The mediation with the school board dragged into January, exhausting Joe emotionally even as legal pressure mounted in her favor. Then, unexpectedly, a familiar name appeared on the witness list submitted by the board's opposing counsel, Reverend Thomas Calloway, Joe's estranged father. Joe went pale reading the notice, unsure whether her father intended to defend her or condemn her publicly. He hasn't spoken to me in 6 years, she said, hands trembling around the paperwork. Why now? The night before the hearing, Joe couldn't sleep, pacing the church aisle where we'd first met months earlier. Whatever he says, I told her. You are not the same scared kid he stopped calling 6 years ago. At the hearing, Reverend Calloway stood slowly, and the room tensed, expecting condemnation dressed in scripture. Instead, he spoke haltingly about pride, about fear, about a letter his daughter once wrote that he'd never answered. I was wrong, he said, voice breaking. Wrong to let silence stand where love should have been. He testified that firing a teacher for her identity contradicted every value he claimed to preach on Sundays. Joe sat frozen, tears streaming silently, 20 years of longing collapsing into that single unexpected moment of vindication. The board, faced with public testimony from a respected local pastor, quietly reinstated Joe's contract within the week. Outside the courthouse, her father approached hesitantly, unsure if 6 years of silence could be undone with mere words. "I don't expect forgiveness today," he said. "But I wanted you to know I finally see you clearly." Joe hugged him, hesitant at first, then fiercely. Years of grief finally finding somewhere honest to land. I watched from a distance, overwhelmed by the strange, healing symmetry of fathers and mothers slowly learning to see us. That night, Joe and I sat on the church steps again, the same steps where everything had quietly begun. "I almost lost everything," she said softly. "My job, my father, maybe even you. All in one winter." "You didn't lose me," I said, pulling her closer. "You never once had to fight for that." We finally told our full story publicly, at the church's 1-year anniversary celebration, no longer hiding behind vague explanations. My mother stood in the crowd, and for the first time, she didn't flinch when Joe took my hand. Reverend Calloway attended too, standing quietly near the back, watching his daughter be celebrated instead of condemned. The diocese, moved by the church's revival and the community's support, agreed to permanently protect it from demolition. Joe and I were asked to co-lead the restoration committee, ensuring the building's future the way it had once secured ours. Word spread beyond Millbrook, and a local paper ran our story under the headline, "Love Saves the Old Stone Church." Reading it together, Joe laughed. "They make it sound simple." It wasn't simple at all. "No," I agreed. "But it was worth every terrifying, complicated step that got us here." Weeks later, on a quiet spring evening, Joe knelt in front of the same altar where I first found her crying, and asked me to build a life with her, surrounded by the stained glass we had restored piece by piece. I said yes, finally certain that some storms lead you exactly where you're meant to be. Then